All right, here we are. Welcome back to Bookwave. Today we're looking at the first half of the Republic. Pat and Will, what were your first impressions of book one of this dialogue?
Just on book one?
Yeah, well, I figured we'll go through them in order.
Okay, well, I mean, once again, we have Socrates hanging out with a group of his friends who don't know how to prove anything for argument's sake and are leaning on Socrates to answer all of their questions.
Mm-hmm.
So it's sets the stage like a typical Socratic dialogue, and it's on justice. And I think in book one they don't really come to any conclusion as to what justice is, but Socrates certainly lays out a bunch of arguments predicated on the notion of analogies between professions and their products and subjects, and that leaves you in a very obscure mire. And it's not until the later books of this first half of the Republic that we get any sort of firm conclusion on what justice is. But we certainly know that justice is not a very simple matter of understanding.
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
the
there's
I think the first book actually ends with the lines, "Well, I guess we don't know what justice really is." And then they start to think up more inquiries as to truly figure out what justice is among the other virtues.
it's all a bunch of what ifs. What if this happened in association with justice, or what if justice happened in this scenario?
Yeah, like for example, someone brings up, well, justice would mean repaying a debt. And then Socrates says something like, well, say you owed your friend a weapon and he wasn't in his right mind and he wanted to kill himself. Would you give back the weapon that you owed him? Would that be just? And of course, it wouldn't be.
Yeah, we have that argument giving each man his due, which is then expanded to be okay, so doing good to your friends and bad to your enemies. But what if your friends aren't actually your friends and your enemies aren't actually your enemies, and good isn't good and bad isn't bad? And it just kind of spirals and is very typically Socratic.
It's a big rabbit hole. And, like, what if we just decided to ignore justice? All forms of justice.
And it leads into the second book pretty quickly, I think. And I think, like, looking at this whole 5 book section that we're talking about today, I really like the term Pat used, the rabbit hole, as a descriptor for it. But I do think that as we do go down and take this journey, we start to develop, or Socrates starts to develop, some very firm ground to stand on, and as we've seen him in the past, establish firm understandings of what it is that is being discussed and the tools with which we will use to uncover this sort of nugget of treasure that they are searching for.
In book two, it kind of leads to desired outcomes. Can justice bring joy, or can justice bring sadness in a way?
Yeah, and they get to the argument of which is more valuable or profitable, justice or injustice.
Well, totally, but slow your roll, boys, because before any of that happens, they establish the social contract theory. Or was that not in your translator's note?
Why don't you refresh our memories for
Yeah.
the
Okay, cool. So that's the other cool part about this. All of our translations are different, so we have different interpretations. But Glaucon, how do I pronounce this, Scott?
Yeah, Glaucon.
So Glaucon,
Plato's uncle.
Sure. Right away establishes that justice is like this mean between doing good and avoiding doing bad so as to avoid having bad done to oneself. And the social contract theory is that in a society where there is punishment for doing bad, that it's better for all parties involved to avoid causing suffering and to just do good. And that's this social contract theory that comes up in the start of book 2.
And I think there's a bit of a refutation to that, or I found one in my notes, where Socrates says that some people that are ignorant of human nature need to do harm to their false friends and good to their false enemies.
That's actually a really great quote.
Yeah.
Yeah.
it kind of incorporates what we were just talking about with Jordan Peterson in the last video we made.
Yes.
So like you kind of get the idea that they all understand the social fabric in like these two different extremes. So it kind of illuminates some of the discussion a little bit, because you know that that's going on in the back of their minds when they talk about justice. There's a lot of nuance in these definitions that they try to create.
I don't think that could be overstated. But yeah, so let's speed our roll back up to this whole notion that they start to bring up, that perhaps injustice is better than justice, and that and there's this whole, like you're saying, this nuance that the just man is almost like Socrates, right? That he's not receiving those things that they think a just man should receive, that an unjust man receives because he seems to be just and is getting away with injustice, whereas Socrates, as we know, ends up being executed for doing his best to be just, and is never on the receiving end of positive rewards for the actions that he's taking, being the gadfly of his country and breaking down all of these false beliefs and doing his best to understand what it is that people think they understand. And this whole destruction of the just man that comes up in this book just made me think of Socrates so much. Like there was this overarching theme of him being that man.
Yeah, and I think that relates to a bit of why some of the translators think the Republic is different from the other dialogues of Socrates, in the way that this version of Socrates is more of just a character than the others, or at least it's more abstracted than the other dialogues.
Absolutely. It feels more like a story than a dialogue.
Yeah, and one thing that is always said about Socrates, it's never mentioned in any record of Socrates that he ever cried. Like, he never shed a tear in any of the dialogues that Plato created, and that's always compared to the fact that Jesus never laughed. But, like, just focusing on the fact that Socrates never cried, like he never felt sorry for himself, always listened to his guiding principles, and just always did what he thought was right, and accepted the consequences. Really laid the groundwork for the Stoic school of thought.
Right.
And he opened up many doors in a way.
So now going back into the realm of Socrates' friends not being capable of answering anything for themselves, they want Socrates to prove that justice is worth it and injustice is not worth it. And they're making this argument that it's almost better to sin and receive the bounty of sinning, and with that bounty sacrifice to appease the gods in a better life or an afterlife. Because if you didn't sin, you wouldn't have any resources and people wouldn't really care about you, and you wouldn't be able to sacrifice to the gods anyways. And so they try to make this argument that injustice might be better than justice.
Yeah, and one of them brings up the argument of the Ring of Gyges, or whatever it's called, the inspiration for Lord of the Rings, or like the old myth where the guy had a ring that turned him invisible,
Right.
and like everyone was like, "Hey, where'd he go?" And they just don't notice that he's there. So like if everybody had the Ring of Power, then everyone would be as unjust as possible.
Yeah, they certainly make that argument that anybody, it's not that people avoid being unjust, it's that they avoid being punished for being caught being unjust, and that anyone given the means would fall into sin because it's just so much more rewarding. But then they come to the argument that injustice does a damage to the mind, and that justice, of course, does an opposite effect to the mind, and that acting right and good is better for the brain and the mental health than acting unjustly and wrong and evilly. That only the sinner knows just how demented his brain has become due to his actions, regardless of how much worldly material possessions he's acquired and how much he's appeased the gods. The resulting detriment is that of his mental capacity, which is something that they go into length about.
Yeah, and that's something we all understand from reading Crime and Punishment.
Don't we just?
Poof, poof.
But
So
book 2 also goes into the idea of pretty much free trade. It lays a lot of the groundwork for like Western civilization in that sense, where there's like free trade and not free trade at the same time, because there's a lot of regulations that they come up with.
And there's also the idea of acquiring knowledge and education through love.
So they have a hard time defining what a just man is and what an unjust man is. And so Socrates shifts the argument towards what a just society, what an unjust society looks like. That if you look at something that's larger, you'll have an easier time seeing what you're looking for. And then once you know what the definition is, you can go back and take the definition of justice from the state and apply it to the individual. And that is essentially the groundwork for the Republic. And that we're going to now establish a just society with all the wonderful virtues that come with it, and be able to take this definition and apply it to the individual to hash out what justice and injustice looks like, and whether justice pays more than injustice, and so on.
And of course, they start with the free trade example.
Of course.
And then they go into how they're going to educate their soldiers with first music and literature, and then gymnastics. And they say, yeah, women and men can both do the same thing, obviously. Why wouldn't they? So why not enlist them all in the army?
Well, I think what was interesting is just how much time they spend on discussing the notion of censorship in this ideal state, and how if you're going to train... So first of all, society is a result of two things: that you need stuff and that you're capable of producing stuff. And you get together with a few individuals, and all of a sudden you have someone who can make food, someone who can make shelter, someone who can make clothes. And they establish the premise that man is best off doing what he's best at. And a society of individuals that do what they're best at and contribute to the benefit of each other will require all sorts of certain necessities, and then by necessity require certain luxuries, and that the establishment of such a state would potentially require more land, and the protection of that land is going to require a military class, which is where we get into the establishment of the guardian people and the education of them therein. And to make the ideal watchdog military class, you need to educate them. And in order to educate them well, you need to censor the content that they learn from a very young age. And they put a lot of weight into how much censorship they would do in terms of literature, and then music and lyric and harmony. And it kind of shocked me.
Yeah. I mean, like, as a musician, when they decided to ban the Lydian scale and the Ionian scale, the first time I read that, I just had to close my book because I was just so upset.
Well, it's too rambunctious, Scott. All you need is music to march to and music to make deals with.
You don't like sad music sometimes?
There's no place for sadness in a watchdog class. As much as there is no need for a watchdog class to learn about the fact that perhaps gods aren't all that, and that...
Yeah, but that's the thing. They don't ban it for the guardians or for the soldiers. They ban it from the state. They take Homer and they strike out half the lines that they don't agree with. They take music and they say you can't use any of these scales at all.
And I think when you're establishing the premise of an ideal society, you need absolutes like that. And when we're looking at a Socratic dialogue where they're trying to discover, in every dialogue I've come across, absolutes, it doesn't surprise me that censorship is a very absolute, overreaching structure that says all of this content needs to be stripped because we want the best, and we want to establish an aristocracy or an aristocracy, however that word's pronounced, of talent. And to get the best talent, we need the best examples, and they lean into the nature-based or the environment-based side of the breeding, that these first 7 years and 20 years of this upbringing and education needs to be curated perfectly so as to have the highest likelihood of creating a perfect race. And it's very interesting when you look at it from where we're sitting in 2019, after all of the genocides we've gone through in the past 400 years, 100 years, whatever you want to look at, 2 years, that this is something that's being discussed about, that we have just at face value a critique of democracy that's 2,600 years old, and a suggestion of an ideal state that has, what is it, eugenics, infanticide, complete overarching censorship, common marriage and children, state nurseries, the abolishment of the nuclear family.
Yeah, I called that a baby redistribution.
That's a good way of looking at it.
Yeah, because, I mean, they don't let parents choose who they're making babies with, or they don't let them choose which babies they're going to raise.
Or let alone who to make love to.
Yeah, and I really liked the amount of thought that went into convincing the bottom tier of the highest class that it was just the luck of the draw that they didn't get to sleep with someone that was much more talented than they were, because the most talented need to sleep with the most talented to produce the most talented. And
I found it was really interesting that they created their own caste system, basically, with some people have gold in their hearts and some people silver and others brass or iron, and that decides what you're gonna be.
Not to mention the fact that at this point in the timeline, they also established the fact that women are essentially equal to men in capabilities and should be trained the same way and should perform in the gymnasium naked in the same way and be given equal opportunity.
Yeah, and that's really saying something if you look at the history of Athens.
Yeah.
That's one of the most sexist city-states of history.
And the way they go about the multiple waves of understanding and progressing their thought by incorporating their own critic into the argument and saying, look, the only one who's stupid is the person that laughs at something they don't understand that is in fact the better, right, and greater principle. And that time has proven time and time again that the things that are resisted and end up being right, you feel pretty stupid for laughing at and rejecting. One of the quotes that really jumped out to me, I don't know if you guys got the same quote because the translator is different, but was somewhere along the lines of a society's need for great doctors and great lawyers is the strongest sign of bad education. I put two more quotes that go along this same trail of thought. So I'll say it again for the kids in the back. A society's need for great doctors and great lawyers is the strongest sign of bad education. And then I added these two quotes. If prescribed a long treatment, he'll probably say he has no time to be ill, and that a life in which one must give all one's attention to one's ailments and none to one's proper job simply is not worth living. And if his constitution is not strong enough, he will simply die and not have to suffer. And if his constitution is strong enough, he will just go back to work and continue to do his job. And the whole notion of being bedladen and wrapped up with issues and ailments and ointments and cures is not something that a working man desires, and that no treatment should be given to the man who cannot survive the routine of his ordinary job and who is therefore of no use to himself or society.
Yeah, that took me right back to Charmides. At the point when Charmides was asking him for a charm, and he's like, well, the charm's not going to do anything. We have to do the hard work first. I have to find out if you're temperate or not.
Yeah. Well, it was, so going back to the quote, the need for great doctors and great lawyers being the strongest sign of bad education really got me thinking, because like, especially like in Canada, in a first world country, we're recruiting like the top doctors and lawyers from other countries that are third world. And often the countries that need them the most are losing the smartest and brightest and most effective individuals to come to these first world countries. And I don't think I'd have to put much effort into making the argument that our education in North America compared to in the East is drastically awful, that our maths are a decade behind some of the other Asian populations out there, and that we have a system that hasn't really been looked at and upgraded and revised in 150 years.
Yeah, around that time.
It's been a minute.
And we have, more so in the United States, we have a system of healthcare wherein you hear more about malpractice lawsuits than you do about breakthrough recoveries, and a pharmaceutical industry that is built on the foundation of Burger King and Pizza Hut, and disease is not being prevented, it's being coped with. And you have this huge population that are taking drugs to keep doing their jobs and losing their ability to live a healthy life, but not actually smart enough to make the changes that would prevent these seriously tragic diseases in the first place. And it's like, so like, I know, Scott, I was telling you a couple weeks ago, I just found out recently that a muscle doesn't start stretching until after about a minute or two of stretching.
Yeah.
And the reason you're taught to stretch a muscle for 10 to 30 seconds is because gym class is 65 minutes long and you have 150 muscles to stretch and you don't have all the time in the world to do it. So you go through your entire life not even knowing how long it takes to stretch a muscle. Imagine just how much other things we're missing out on because of the time crunch and the test result driven education system. Our curriculum isn't based on making us good people. Why do you think we have this podcast? We're reading all these books we wish we could have read in high school and in college and in elementary school that other civilizations are able to read. Other cultures are able to read. By grade 4, you have kids reading Shakespeare, but not ours.
Yeah, and you said something really great. That we don't know how to stretch a muscle. And our brain is the most important muscle of all, and that's the one we neglect the most.
Yeah. And I think, like, as a Canadian, we're really proud of our free healthcare system. But, like, how much are we missing? How far from the point are we that we have this huge population where, so you go into a doctor's office and they're being paid by your taxes. So effectively, they're your employee. They are there to serve you, and they're being paid from your taxes as a wage earner, and you refer to them as doctor. So they have a title, which means they're more important than you. And all of a sudden, you're less important than them, and you're lower on the status in society that is ingrained in us in our limbic system. You with me on that?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So we have this huge industry of people, nurse, dentist, doctor, that are telling us how to live our life because we haven't gotten the education to figure out how to brush our teeth, floss, eat 5 vegetables a day, 4 fruits a day, and stretch for 20 minutes a day. And
It's an old system. They're relying on an old system 50 or hundreds of years ago, and they're still using it to this day, and not, like you said, not being aware of our current reality. And that's why there's so many countries like Japan that are like 5 or 10 years ahead of us, because they have a structured system that relies on getting everything in order and making sure that everything goes by properly and efficiently and effectively. Nothing missing. If one small thing is out, then everybody's on pause. We have to get that back up in order to start moving again. But we don't have that. It's just kind of like if we miss one thing, it's like, whatever. It'll come back.
Oh, exactly. Which brings us back full circle to this notion of this ideal society. Socrates says people need to know philosophy. People need to be able to do the bare minimum of exercise, and they need to be eating enough to be healthy, but they need to pursue knowledge, and they need to understand truths, and they need to be not distracted by all of the poems and all of the songs, but they have to have this root of philosophical understanding, and that a truly good ideal society would probably be led by a philosopher king.
And that's his conclusion, pretty much, of these 5 books, is that we need a philosopher king as the most important part of this state. Like, that's the first and foremost prerequisite for the perfect state, is a philosopher king.
And further to the point, they do establish a definition of justice on this path, which is minding one's business, doing what one is best at, which was their original premise for founding this ideal state, was that a society is composed of people that are good at doing one thing, and that when they do that one thing well and are able to devote their time to it, that is justice.
No virtue signaling. No celebrities telling us what to do or what to think. Just stick to acting.
Exactly. The shoemaker makes the shoes. The politician does the politicking.
Yeah, the soldiers do the soldiering.
And the wives have babies for 20 years every year and don't raise their children.
Yeah. You know, like, there's a lot of parts of this book that I really like, and some that just, I don't know how they reach that conclusion. But at the same time, like, this is written at a time where, like, there was no such thing as the concept of freedom of speech. Like, they wouldn't even consider it back then. Like, we got to tell people to shut up sometime, right?
Yeah.
This was all early development too.
Yeah.
The world was just starting.
Yeah. That's why I kind of see the Republic as like a starting point for capitalism, but also a starting point for communism and authoritarianism in really extreme cases.
And tyranny and the like. Yeah, and I think
they try to combine the Republic as like a combination of tyrannies, democracies, and aristocracies.
And timarchies.
Yeah.
But like those don't really exist in.
They try to draw elements from each system.
The
like,
best of each, yeah.
One thing that's kind of weird about like the Philosopher King, and I've heard the description of the American system. I've heard it described as a system that works even if the ruler is an idiot. So like, it doesn't matter. Like, that was the goal of the American system, was to make a system that wouldn't fall apart even if like a real tyrant got in charge. He wouldn't be able to destroy the Republic of the United States. Like, that seems like an oversight on Plato and Socrates' end, because like, once your Philosopher King dies, then what's gonna happen? Like, we know what happens. After Marcus Aurelius died, all the other Roman emperors kind of, went to hell in a handbasket.
Yeah. And that's the thing, like, goodness breeds badness and badness breeds goodness is the simplest way I can express it. That for some reason, human nature seems to be cursed to want to dabble in the thing that it doesn't have experience with. And even if you created the ideal state, the very ideal that is good would breed this dark, perverted desire to try out the other thing. Yeah. And we see that with like one of the cases that a friend of mine and I discuss is you have an alcoholic, has twin children. They grow up in a household with an alcoholic. They're the exact same kid, essentially, but one of them grows up and never touches alcohol, and the other one grows up and is an alcoholic. Well, why is it? They had the same experience, but they decided to take two completely opposite paths in reaction to it. And so when you have an ideal state, sure, things are all peachy keen, but that doesn't mean that they're going to stay that way. Like you said, when the Philosopher King dies, you have room for growth and room for destruction.
Yeah, and that's something that they don't consider either end of. They see that they're building the perfect state, so why would it change at all?
Yeah.
They don't want it to change. They want it to stay exactly the same Philosopher King in charge all the time. That's why they feel the need to choose all their guardians at a young age and kind of just breed them as copies of themselves, indoctrinate them with all the same ideals. And there's a quote relating to that saying, God is not the author of all things, but of the good only. So they consider that the only things that are good come from the divine, so we just have to do away with all the bad. Like those lines in Homer that talk about Hades. Can't be talking about Hades to these kids, or they'll be thinking they're going to hell if they do something wrong. They need to be fearless and brave and conquer their enemies in the battlefield. And the myth of Hades kind of gets replaced by the myth of in the later books of the Republic. But we'll reach that when we get there.
So one last defense I will bring up of Socrates' ideal state. I think it's Thrasymachus that asks him to demonstrate how to reach the ideal state. And he says a couple things, but primarily, does practice ever square with theory? Is it not in the nature of things that whatever people think, practice should fall short of the precision of theory? What do you think? I agree. Then don't insist on my showing that every detail of our description can be realized in practice, but grant that we shall have met your demand that the ideal should be realized if we are able to find the conditions under which a state can approximate most closely to it. Will you be content with that? I would.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we talk about all the time when we bring up Jordan Peterson. You got to aim for that star. But, sometimes that star moves a little bit, but you wouldn't have made it to that star if you didn't try for the first time. And
exactly.
Correct your journey each and every step of the way.
Any closing notes on this one, guys?
It's just that this is a giant rabbit hole. One question leads to a scenario, and the scenario leads to another question, and there's just a lot to unpack here that I think that if we continue to just talk about these 5 books, it would just be a never-ending argument, and we would not go on to the last 4 books or 5 books.
I do like the one part where they're trying to locate the 4 cardinal virtues within their state. And they say, like, well, where is wisdom? And they say it's among the rulers, and they say, where's temperance and all that? Well, that'd be in the auxiliaries, and then they eventually make it to justice, and then they say, well, this is what's left, so this must be what justice is, almost. Like a process of elimination.
That was one of the weirder attempts to hone in and isolate a truth, but I liked it. It reached its goal. Well, I said it at the onset. I think that reading the Republic is an incredibly beneficial endeavor, and that it is one that ought to be undertook by anyone who is interested in forming a political opinion.
Yeah.
If you think that you are a fan of democracy, if you think you are not a fan of democracy, if you think that there is a better political system, I would suggest to you that you read a book about democracy that's been around for 2,600 years and realize that you are a new player at a very old game.
Yeah, that's one of the biggest takeaways for me when I finished this book the first time. I was like, wow, I really don't know anything about politics. Better get started.
Hear, hear.
Yep.
So if that's all, like, comment, subscribe. The podcast is over, but that doesn't mean the conversation has to end. Leave your opinions in the comment section down below.
Let me know how I pissed you off today.
May the force be with you.
Or equal to mass times acceleration.
Poof, poof.